Let me first show you the plan of the presentation. I will briefly introduce the problem itself, so the problem of vaccination optimization, and I will discuss the influence of non-diagnosed cases because this work is based on computational optimization. I will show you experiments, namely the algorithm, the problem instances, of course, the goals of the experiments and the results, and I will try to draw some conclusions at the end. The scenario considered in this paper is a scenario in which an epidemic outbreak has already taken place, and we perform optimization in order to apply a limited number of vaccine doses in the best way we can. In this particular paper, I assume that the network of contacts is known. Well, these assumptions, of course, do not hold in every possible epidemic scenario, but in some of these scenarios they do. In particular, when you have localized outbreaks, for example, in the case of zoonosis, when you have a pathogen coming from animals, such as an Ebola virus, for example. Also in cases of bioterrorism, when somebody tries to infect people, for example, you can expect rather localized outbreaks of an epidemic. The limitation on vaccine doses can be present when a new vaccine is being introduced, as was the case in the previous year, 2019, with experimental Ebola vaccines. Sometimes mass vaccination can be even prohibited by law, for example, in animals. In the case of the foot and mouth disease, it is so that in the EU you can't mass vaccinate, only reactive vaccinations are permitted. And also, of course, there exist some vaccination strategies like ring vaccination, for example, which involve vaccinating a limited number of individuals. As for the network of contacts, again, of course, there are some uncertainties in this case. However, especially if we are at the initial stage of the epidemic, we can try to identify those individuals which were in contact with the infected ones. If the outbreak is localized, this can be also true. And also notably, in the case of animal diseases, usually it's much easier to trace the network of contacts because, for example, in the case of livestock, transports are traced, and transports are very often responsible for spreading the disease. So it's quite easy to trace the contacts of the infected animals. Of course, as I mentioned, there are many sources of uncertainty, and also there are dynamic aspects in epidemic modeling. We have, for example, a situation when we do not know all the parameters. For example, even the transmission rate can be established without certainty. Also, you sometimes do not know the outcomes of preventive actions. But in this paper, we focus on the non-deterministic spreading of the disease and unknown cases, meaning the cases which are present, but we have not observed them yet. However, also the problem of unknown and dynamic network of contacts is interesting, and it's studied in a follow-up paper, which is mentioned at the bottom of the slide here. The approach here is to optimize the vaccination scheme using what we know at the moment when we optimize. So we use the known cases or possibly also some artificially generated ones. We assume at the moment that the network of contacts is known and the optimizer works with this information. And of course, finally, the solution obtained using the optimizer is applied in this case to a real, of course, also simulated epidemic, which means using those cases which were known and those which were unknown to the optimizer. The simulation of the epidemic itself is performed using the SIRV model. However, in this case, it is not just a compartmental model in which we just divide the population into parts which are in given states, but we simulate the state of each individual on a network, which is represented as a graph. So we have individuals as vertices and edges as contacts between them. The spreading is simulated using this SIRV model, which means we have 4 different states, which you can see here in the in the figure. There are some transmission probabilities between transition probabilities between these states, and of course there are some numerical parameters like the number of vertices in the graph, the size of the initial outbreak, and so on. As I said, we simulate the epidemic on the graph, and this means that at each time step, each vertex in this graph can be in one of the states, which are 4 states used in this particular model. And of course, the state of the entire graph can be described as a vector of states for each of the vertices. We are given at the beginning, of course, the graph and a certain initial graph state, and the simulation starts at time 0 from this initial state. And of course, it continues in discrete time steps. Actually, if you have a non-zero probability of recovery in this particular model, the epidemic is guaranteed to stop after some time. And the optimization problem in this case, as I mentioned, is a problem of optimizing the vaccination scheme, which means the assignment of vaccines to the vertices of the graph. And this means that we have the set space of binary vectors with the length equal to the number of vertices in this graph. Because of course we need to decide which vertices to vaccinate, which are represented by ones in this binary vector. And the objectives in this problem are the number of vaccine doses and the number of infected vertices in the graph after the simulation stops. So we have a bi-objective optimization problem. The first objective is rather easy to determine because this requires only calculating the number of ones in the vaccination vector in the solution vector. However, the second objective is obtained by simulating, so it is rather computationally intensive. In this problem, there is an uncertainty which is introduced by not making all the initial disease cases known to the optimizer. And of course, this means that the simulated epidemic which is seen by the optimizer is less severe than the real one. However, we try to mitigate this effect by adding some more disease cases to the initial state. So we have the initial state, which is here, the actual one, and we have the initial state, which is made known to the optimizer. They of course differ, and this difference is controlled by the parameters which you see in the slide. So we only make a fraction of the original cases known to the optimizer. They are copied from the actual initial state to the other one. And we have this R0 parameter which controls how many random cases are added. Of course, if it is 0, there are no additional cases, and of course, if it is larger than 0, a corresponding fraction of additional cases is added to this initial state from which we start the optimization. This is also shown here in the picture, so you can see that you have the initial state as 0, which is the actual one, but of course we do not know all the cases. In this case, only half of them are known, and then we add some more here. So this means that the number of cases in this case happens to be the same. Of course, it doesn't have to be the case because we don't know how many there are, and we just add some of them. For optimizing, for finding optimal solutions or Pareto optimal solutions in this case, the MOIAD algorithm was used. Of course, it has some parameters. These parameters mentioned here, the number of neighbors replaced, and the the probability of selecting the parents from the neighborhood of a solution are taken from the literature, and the size of the neighborhood is set to an odd number, namely 21, motivated by findings from a previous paper which studied the algorithm itself. It turned out to be beneficial to have an odd number of neighbors. Of course, in this algorithm, the solution is a binary vector. Of course, it just represents the number of, the locations of the vertices to vaccinate. And correspondingly, the operators used in this algorithm are operators working on the binary representation. The evaluation of a solution is performed using simulation, as I mentioned. The solution is a binary vector, and the first objective is straightforward to calculate. We just count the number of elements in the vector equal to 1. And after that, the spreading of the disease has to be simulated, starting from the known initial state. And the vaccination is applied in this way that, of course, we take elements from this solution vector equal to 1, and the corresponding vertices are vaccinated. However, we assume that vaccination will not be successful for those vertices which are already infected in the initial state. Because this problem is non-deterministic, the simulations have to be repeated many times, and for the calculation of the second objective, the number of infected individuals in the network is averaged over these simulations. Of course, each simulation can give a different result. At the bottom of the slide, you can see some parameters. The stopping criterion is based on the number of objective function evaluations, and there are some parameters which are typical to evolutionary algorithms, like the size of the population and probabilities of the operators. So the experimental work was performed on certain problem instances which are based on graphs. You have a graph and two initial states. One is the actual one used for the final evaluation to see how our optimized solution would perform in actual state. And of course, we start the optimizing using only the known state here, which differs obviously, as discussed in previous slides. For the graph, of course, it is important to say how many nodes there are, but also what's the architecture of the network. And in this case, we assumed that the network is an REDS graph. So it's a very interesting model which simulates a social network structure. Of course, there is no time to discuss it in detail. So, of course, the states are created as we discussed before, and the experiments were performed on such a set of instances. So the goal of experiments was to first see if the optimization works at all. So if the targeted vaccination scheme yields better results than the other schemes, the mass vaccination scheme, namely. And we wanted to know if there is an influence of non-diagnosed cases on the effectiveness of the optimization, and of course, if the approach which just adds some random cases works in this case to mitigate the lack of knowledge we may have. So the targeted vaccination scheme used here was, of course, based on the solution. So each solution, as I mentioned before, is a binary vector pointing to the vertices which will be vaccinated, and the objectives are calculated as the number of elements set to 1, which is the number of vaccine doses used, and the second objective is the number of infected vertices after the simulation is complete. And for the mass vaccination scheme, the same number of vertices is vaccinated but randomly selected. And of course, the corresponding F2 objective is the result of the simulations, averaged over 100 simulations, as you can see in the slide. For comparison of these two schemes, two things can be used. One is the hypervolume, because it's a bi-objective optimization, of course, but also for a given solution, you can compare how those schemes performed by using just the number of infected cases in the mass vaccination scheme and the targeted vaccination scheme, which is a straightforward measure. If it is larger than 1, it shows that the targeted scheme was better. Here you see a comparison using Pareto fronts. As you can see, the experiments here were performed by using all known cases. So there are no unknown cases for now. So the full knowledge is assumed, and there were no additional cases, just to see how well the optimization works with the most knowledge possible. And of course, the results differ with changing of the number of vertices in the graph, and with changing of the size of the initial outbreak. For larger graphs and for larger initial outbreaks, the problem becomes more difficult, as evidenced by the fact that this Pareto front is more to the top right, of course, meaning more entities have to be vaccinated and more of them get infected. And also, as you can see, the advantage of the optimization diminishes in this case. But notably, the targeted vaccination scheme for the full knowledge scenario was always outperforming the case when we had the mass vaccination scheme. So optimization is always beneficial in this case. So it's a certain baseline to start from. And for studying the unknown cases influence, it was studied if we have no additional cases, but different fraction of the cases known to the optimizer, what happens, and it was measured by using this delta V coefficient. And it shows that, of course, when we have more knowledge, it's easier to beat the mass vaccination scheme, as evidenced by the yellow parts of the graphs here and on the histogram. So you have many situations when your delta V is actually much better shows a much better performance of the targeted vaccination scheme. When there is less knowledge, for example, you only know 10% of the cases, it's much harder to beat the mass vaccination scheme, of course, with the optimization, as evidenced by the fact that this curve here is very steep. So in most cases, you only attain a value of 1 at best here. So of course, the problem becomes more difficult for larger graphs also, as evidenced by previous results. And here you can also see that this is the same problem. Here you see the conclusion from this part of experiments. Of course, as I mentioned, the advantage of optimization diminishes for larger graphs and for larger initial outbreaks. And of course, it's harder to beat the mass vaccination scheme in this case. And also, of course, the lack of knowledge is detrimental. And for very large graphs and for very little knowledge about the initial cases, it even may happen that the mass vaccination scheme is actually better. This is evidenced not only by the graphs, but also by the data tables present in the slides and also in the paper. So there was a question after these 2 rounds of experiments, if we can actually assume that with full knowledge, our targeted vaccination scheme is better, but with the lack of knowledge, it becomes less and less beneficial. So can it be alleviated in a way by just adding random cases? And you see in the slide the way in which it was done. So to the known cases, some additional ones were added using this R0 parameter. And if you look at how the optimizer sees the problem, please note that this is during optimization situation. You can observe that the blue curve here is the real situation when you have full knowledge but no additional cases here, and the orange one is actually overly pessimistic because we use all the known cases, but we add 5 times as many. So of course it becomes much more severe. And the 2 scenarios, green and red, are ones in which we only know 10% of the cases, but we either do not add anything or add 5 times as many random cases. And of course, you can see that the green one is rather close to the blue one. So it performs, I think, quite nicely because knowing only 10% of the cases and generating the additional ones at random, you can more or less come closer to the real Pareto front, which makes the optimizer see situation as it should be. As for numerical results, there are data tables here. I will not go over all the results here because, as you can see, there are many for different sizes of graphs, for different values of the parameters. But it can be noted that, of course, if you only know a fraction of the initial cases, your performance will deteriorate, as evidenced by the fact that there are values lower than 1 here. If you add random cases, the situation improves. These are results for the initial outbreak being 1% of the graph, and for the 10% of the graph, the values of course differ. And you may observe that if you add 5 times as many as the known cases at random, you can consistently beat the mass vaccination scheme, which is interesting because we added additional cases even if there was full knowledge, which of course cannot be stated because you don't know if you know all the cases or not. You may estimate it maybe. So this approach seems to be promising. And of course, going now to conclusions, you can observe that this targeted vaccination scheme works, but lack of knowledge actually makes it work a little worse. And this can be counteracted by adding some random disease cases to the scenario which we consider. However, as you could see from the table and from this very brief discussion, of course, it's more detailed in the paper, it would be probably beneficial to have some mechanism for estimating, at least, if not predicting, how many cases you should add. So how many cases do you know and how many to add. So thank you for being here, and I think it's time to finish now. So thank you, and of course, if you have any questions, I'm glad to answer them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really very topical paper for the time, so very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just a very initial question. I mean, since everything, because I'm sure when you prepared this paper was long before the current coronavirus situation occurred. Have you been involved in any work specifically with the current situation?
No, at the moment, not. With the current situation, no. However, this paper it was done in the context of a project which is mentioned in slide, I think, 5, which is about a study on animal diseases on the network of contacts which are due to transport of animals. So the scope in which this work was performed was of animal diseases, and the thing is that in the case of animal diseases, we know the network of contacts. It's much easier to understand the network of contacts, and because of this, we assume this will be a good approach for this particular problem. And also in this project, another paper was written. We written another paper in which we also studied the influence of lack of knowledge of the network of contacts, because we can assume that we know some of them and some of them we do not. Honestly, I think that in the current situation we have, it's much more difficult to estimate the contacts, and that's the big problem, of course. So
that's great. Okay.
To optimize also.
Super. So thanks very much. I've got a question here from Bill. A question: how is the graph mapped to binary solution vector? Do search operators used in MOEA, multi-objective EA, such the assume representation has structure, e.g. first point crossover versus uniform crossover?
Yes. In this case, the solution is just the binary vector. So for now, in this particular paper, I use just the operators which are not informed. They simply operate on binary vectors. If you want, you may go to my website, which is given in the first slide. There are publications there. And in some of those papers, I used also informed operators, for example, using machine learning for trying to understand what parameters of vertices in the graph should be used for deciding which parts of the vector to take in crossover, and which elements to mutate, for example. So in this particular paper, the operators are regular binary crossover and like one point crossover, for example. But in other papers, I used dedicated operators for the graph-based problems, especially for preventing the graph from a threat spreading, like the epidemic or something similar. So if you are interested, you may go, or we can discuss, of course, after the talk also these approaches.
That's super. Thank you. Is that okay, Bill? Have you got any more questions, or did you want to add anything more?
Stephen, I have a comment. I cannot raise my hand because I am host. So
fine. Thanks.
Just a comment regarding the models with this kind of model with the coronavirus. Here in Spain, a group in Valencia also made some experiments and some prediction with this kind of models.
Okay.
They found very good results and prediction that now are confirming. Mm-hmm. But they need to stop now here in Spain because of the difficulty of testing the correct data, because you know, especially with the death in the all residences is becoming very difficult. Mm-hmm. But this kind of model are working, and precisely yesterday, they asked me about any multi-objective approach for this problem. So I'm going to comment the work to them, and
Oh, that
perhaps
would
we
be very
can
nice. That would be
collaborate.
I would be very glad to cooperate on this, of course.
Okay, and thank you. And that was my comment, Stephen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If you can put me in contact, that would be very nice, of course.
Yes, I work with them, so I will talk to you this afternoon in the poster session, Krzysztof.
Good.
Thanks. Just to follow up, Bill, just on following up from the answer, it's just asking, so the mapping is random, that's his question.
I mean, the correspondence between the binary vector and the vertices in the graph is 1-to-1. So if you have a vector from this binary space, here the safe space for the problem, you may see that there are as many elements in this vector as the vertices in the graph. So the first element in the vector is one of the vertices, and another one is the next one and the next one. And if the value of in the vector is 1, it means that this particular vertex is vaccinated. So for each solution, each position in the vector corresponds to a particular vertex in the graph. However, the structure of the graph is only used for simulations. This is a network of contacts for simulating the epidemic, and the operators in this particular paper are not aware of the structure of the graph. In my other papers, I use some machine learning techniques, for example, to extract knowledge from the graph and make the operators informed, I mean, more aware of the problem they solve.
Great, thank you. Right, so time is moving on, only 10 minutes before the next session. If there are any final questions, please chat to me super quickly. Otherwise, I think I'm just going to close the session. So I'd like to thank all the speakers and also for the people asking the questions as well. I think we had some really interesting talks there. So I'm very encouraged by that and would like, hopefully this will continue this special session next year as well. But really just a big thank you to everybody, and hope to see you in, maybe in Sevilla next year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, goodbye.